Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to start a new series of 7 episodes. One a week. 7 episodes about the 7 wonders of the ancient world. When they are all published, I will edit them together with an introduction about the origin of the list of wonders. Because this list changed and stabilized long after these monuments were built. But tonight, we are talking about the first of these 7 wonders, and also the last one to be built, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. So please let me know in the comments what you think about this series, and also the idea of having shorter but more frequent episodes. And now, it is time for you to adopt a comfortable position, because our journey to the past begins right now. For people who arrived by sea to Alexandria in Egypt more than 2,000 years ago, this must have been a breathtaking sight. A high tower of stone, at least 330 feet high, or more than 100 meters, richly decorated and topped by a powerful light that signaled by night to all ships miles around that they were approaching one of the most important ports of the Mediterranean world. Alexandria, capital of Egypt. This lighthouse was, and remained for many centuries after it was built, one of the tallest man-made structures in the entire world, only surpassed by the tallest of pyramids. As you may know, ancient Egypt was called the breadbasket of the Mediterranean due to its abundant food production. For thousands of years, on top of feeding its millions of inhabitants, a large number at the time, Egypt could often export parts of its production, as well as other goods, papyrus, crafts, and also African and Arabian products that had transited through it, like gold, ivory, or frankincense. By the last centuries before Christ, the port of Alexandria had become the main gateway in and out of Egypt for goods and people, and also the capital of one of the most powerful kingdoms of the Mediterranean, the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Together with the great library of Alexandria, the lighthouse reflected the wealth, the might, and the influence, the prestige that the sovereigns of Egypt wanted to project. But who were these sovereigns? Why did they order the building of such a spectacular lighthouse? And what was this structure like? Or what do we know of it, because it no longer exists? And what happened to it? This is what we are going to explore. To begin with, Ptolemaic Egypt, what does it mean? The Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt was a long-lasting remain, of the empire of Alexander the Great. Alexander invaded essentially the ancient Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, which he destroyed. But only after a decade of brilliant military campaigns that took him from Greece to India, he died young, and his empire quickly crumbled. In 10 years, the Greeks had had time to build an administration across the Middle East. And just after the undisputed master of this immense empire had disappeared, after the death of Alexander, his closest followers, his generals, were quick to seize the opportunity. They formed kingdoms called Hellenistic kingdoms, Greek-led states whose population was not Greek, on the ruins of Alexander's empire. This happened shortly after his death in the 4th century BC, in 336 BC precisely. One of the most attractive or enviable parts of this empire, and also one of the first Persian provinces conquered by Alexander, after he had repelled the Achaemenids from Turkey and Syria, was Egypt. As I said, Egypt was rich in all meanings of the word. It was highly populated. It produced a large quantity of food and other goods. It had beautiful, large cities and an impressive culture that the Greeks respected. And that says something, because the Greeks used to consider other peoples as culturally inferior to them. But the 1,000 years old culture of Egypt and its monuments were too spectacular, too obvious to be ignored. And dominion over Egypt went to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. Egypt, plus a few dependencies in Libya, the island of Cyprus, or the province of Judea. This formed the powerful Ptolemaic kingdom. So this was a state populated essentially by Egyptians who still followed their ancient culture, including their religion, but who were ruled by foreigners. They had been ruled by the Persian emperors before. They would now be ruled by Greek sovereigns. Even though during this Ptolemaic period, Egypt was no longer the beacon of civilization and the great power it had been in the 2nd millennium BC or the 3rd millennium BC, it was still a period of relative prosperity and peace most of the time, that lasted for almost 300 years, until the death of the last descendant of Ptolemy, Queen Cleopatra VII, the famous one, and after her death, the annexation of Egypt to the Roman Empire. Alexandria did not exist before the Greek invasion. The city was founded by Alexander himself, and actually there were several Alexandrias founded by Alexander across his empire. Alexandria of Egypt happened to be the most famous and successful of these new cities. Its location was not random, it was a strategic location for the Greeks. West of the delta of the Nile, it offered communication on waterways with the river and the whole valley of the Nile, very important for trade or for political control. But choosing a location on the coast was also significant. It showed the will to connect Egypt to the rest of the Greek world, in the Mediterranean, to the north, to open it to trade, as opposed to its previous connection with the Persian Empire that was centered on Mesopotamia and the Persian plateau. About 30 years after its foundation, when it was still a young city, Alexandria was chosen as the capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom, another significant change symbolically for Egypt. There had been several capitals of ancient Egypt at the time of its splendor, but the capital had moved along the valley of the Nile and in the delta. Ancient capitals included cities like Memphis, near the place where the delta begins, or Waset, better known as Thebes, on the site of the modern Luxor in the south. After Thebes, it was Pi-Ramses in the delta to the north. But none of these capital cities were on the coast. These choices of capitals reflected the will of pharaohs, of sovereigns, to administrate their kingdom rather than open it to foreign trade. So Alexandria was different. It was not an old Egyptian city, and from the start it was destined to be a cultural crossroads, with strong Egyptian and Greek influences, obviously, and because of trade, the presence of many other cultures and communities, reflecting the variety of the Mediterranean world. And this continued long after antiquity and even after the Middle Ages. Alexandria remained an important port and a cosmopolitan city long after the Ptolemies had gone. And this takes us back to the lighthouse. In order to affirm their relevance, both to their own subjects and outside, the Ptolemaic kings and queens that succeeded on the throne for almost 3 centuries needed to show off. They were not Egyptian, and they needed to make up for it, which they did by embracing Egyptian culture, at least publicly. They revered Egyptian gods, and they built monuments for them. Many of the best preserved large temples in Egypt today are from the Ptolemaic period. They also claimed the title of pharaohs, and they appeared as pharaohs on monuments or on the coins they issued. And like the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, they would commission spectacular monuments because a powerful, legitimate sovereign of ancient Egypt had to also be a builder in stone. At the same time, they didn't forget their Greek origins. They were certainly quite proud of them, and of the closeness to Alexander at the origin of the dynasty. And so what they built in Alexandria and in Egypt, their palaces, their tombs, the library, the lighthouse, many of these buildings had a clear Greek influence. There was a mix of cultures and aesthetical traditions going on. I'm telling you all these different things about Egypt and the Ptolemies because the lighthouse was the product, the embodiment of all these things. The commercial vocation of Alexandria and its openness to Mediterranean trade as the gateway to Egypt. The mix of Greek and Egyptian influences, the willingness of the dynasty to impress with spectacular works and prestigious ones, and also the very practical need for a large lighthouse in a large port where ships came and went constantly, bringing and taking away goods. So the construction was decided by Ptolemy I himself, but it would only be completed during the reign of his son and successor. It took 12 years in total. The site that was chosen was on a small island, an island called Pharos. Actually, the lighthouse is also sometimes called the Pharos of Alexandria. And in Greek or in Romance languages, the word for lighthouse Phare in French, Faro in Spanish or Italian, comes from this, the island of Pharos. The city of Alexandria itself was founded on an isthmus opposite Pharos. Later the city expanded well beyond this original isthmus, and to connect Pharos to the city, a long mole of more than a kilometer, 0.7 mile, was also built. But what did the lighthouse look like? We know about that thanks to multiple descriptions from antiquity to the Middle Ages, because the building really lasted a long time. This is what gives us total certainty that it existed. There are hundreds of different documents, sources, describing or referring to it. And it is not only recorded, archaeologists have found its remains. So based on these descriptions and archaeology, we know that it was built with solid blocks of limestone and granite. These were usual choices for Egypt, and that the height was somewhere between 330 and 390 feet, that is to say 100 to 118 meters, on a square base of 30 by 30 meters, that's 98 by 98 feet. That was very high for its base at the time, and as you know, in stone architecture, a limiting factor when it comes to height is the weight of the upper levels of a structure. To make it viable, a high stone structure needs a relatively large base that can support the rest. This technical constraint probably explains that pyramid-like structures were often built by ancient cultures under different proportions. We find them in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, or Mesoamerica. There were certainly aesthetical and symbolic reasons for this appeal of pyramids. But apart from this, another advantage of this shape is that it does not collapse and it solves the weight problem for large stone structures. The lighthouse was probably even more breathtaking for contemporaries of its building, because it was not a pyramid. It looked clearly vertical, with 3 levels, 3 tiers. The base started with a square section that would have represented about half of its height. On top of this square section, there was a middle octagonal section, and it was smaller than the square. This had the advantage of limiting its weight. And finally, at the top, there was a circular section, topped by a mirror that reflected sunlight during the day, and a furnace that was lit at night. The building was not just a pile of rocks, it was hollow, at least in some parts, and so you could use inner stairs or ladders, we don't exactly know how the inside was made, to climb to the top. It was also richly decorated with statues and carvings. All of these dedicated to Greek deities, like Zeus or Triton, the god of the sea, the son of Poseidon. The statue of Zeus or Poseidon was also placed at the very top of the lighthouse. This type of structure in tiers, with a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a circular top, is something that turned out to be influential. In much more modest proportions, it was also used to build at least one funerary monument in Ptolemaic Egypt, a tomb in the city of Abu Sir, 30 miles from Alexandria. And this influence went on, including centuries after the building. An example is the design of minarets based on the same three sections in many early Egyptian mosques. They were inspired by the lighthouse that still existed at the time. Being essentially a stone structure, the lighthouse was resistant to fires. In many antique cities, fires were always the biggest hazard for buildings, and it was also maintained well by the masters of Alexandria. After the Ptolemies, Alexandria became a city of the Roman Empire, and it kept prospering despite the loss of its status as a capital, because the elite of Egypt stayed in Alexandria, and its destiny to be the entry and exit point of Egypt for goods and many travelers was confirmed in Roman times after the annexation of Egypt, ensuring that the port remained always busy. So the Roman administration took care of the lighthouse for centuries, and it went on until the Arab conquest of the 7th century AD. Egypt became a predominantly Muslim country, but its new rulers would keep the lighthouse working until medieval times. What the lighthouse was not immune to, though, was earthquakes. And in case of earthquakes, its dangerously vertical shape became a problem. There was a first earthquake that damaged it at the end of the 8th century. In fairness, the lighthouse was already 1,000 years old at this point, so it had really stood the test of time for a building. But it was partially cracked by this earthquake, according to contemporary records. And again in 951, 150 years later. So that when another shake took place in 956, only 5 years later, the structure had already been weakened, and this time it collapsed partially. But not beyond repair. Repairs took place in the second half of the 10th century AD. The capital city of Egypt had moved again to Cairo at the time, but Alexandria remained a very relevant city and one of the largest ports of the Mediterranean. By the Middle Ages, Alexandria had become one of the few contact points between the Islamic and Christian worlds when it came to trade. A role that would only grow along the Middle Ages, as Alexandria became the place where goods, not only from Egypt, but also from the Middle East or that came along the Silk Road, would converge, and European merchants, especially Italian merchants from Venice or Genoa, would send ships to do business in Alexandria. In the 10th century we were not there yet, but the lighthouse remained very useful, and it was systematically maintained and repaired, with a few changes in style. For example, the statue at the top, which had fallen, was replaced by an Islamic-style dome. And it kept working for 300 more years, until a very destructive earthquake in 1303, at the beginning of the 14th century, and yet another one in 1323. These earthquakes made the structure completely collapse, beyond repair. Only ruins were left. You remember that the lighthouse was on Pharos, this island only connected to the city by this artificial mole. So it stood a bit away from the city itself. And so it remained as a pile of rocks, a ruin, for another century and a half. Until some of the remaining stone blocks were used by the late 15th century to build a medieval fort, a citadel, on the platform where the lighthouse once stood. 1800 years after its building, the lighthouse had gone. The most impressive monument left by the Ptolemies was no more. But it was not forgotten. The lighthouse was already famous in antiquity, and it was still known by scholars and travelers of the Middle Ages around the Middle East, North Africa and Europe. Alexandria kept living and growing. It has more than 6 million inhabitants today, and it is the second largest city in Egypt. And its flag shows the lighthouse, even though the monument no longer exists. Because the port had been transformed many times, and the area was heavily populated, and also there were so many other ancient sites in Egypt, searching for archaeological remains of the lighthouse was regularly postponed in the 19th and 20th centuries, until the rediscovery of the site in 1968. After that, it was only in 1994, 30 years ago, that the site was explored systematically, especially underwater, because the island of Pharos had long disappeared as an island. Today it is connected to the continent, urbanized, and it contains part of the city center of Alexandria and port infrastructures. The fort built where the lighthouse once stood still exists too. But the physical remains of the lighthouse that had not been used to build this little citadel were rediscovered in 1994 on the seafloor. Underwater, archaeologists found scattered remains of statues and columns. Actually, it appeared that these were not just the ruins of the lighthouse. There were also remains of temples, houses, wells that had fallen into the sea after earthquakes. More than 3,000 pieces were identified, and some of them were brought back to the surface, but the majority are still underwater, forming one of the largest submerged archaeological sites in the world. Some of these pieces are even older than the foundation of Alexandria. Some had carvings dating from the 2nd millennium BC, indicating that some blocks with carvings had been brought from other sites in Egypt after the foundation of Alexandria, presumably during the Ptolemaic period, when Alexandria was a capital that deserved the best of what Egypt had to offer. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. Stay tuned for the next episode, which will be about the Colossus of Rhodes. You may now let yourself go and fall asleep, or pick another story if you don't feel sleepy yet. Sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.